startup society would ride behind, say, the support of Malta's FDA for a new biomedical regime. For the case of doing it within the US, you'd need a governor who'd declare a sanctuary state for biomedicine. That is, just like a sanctuary city declares that it won't enforce federal immigration law, a sanctuary state for biomedicine would not enforce FDA writ. With this diplomatic recognition, you could then take the existing American code base and add one crucial new feature: the absolute right for anyone to buy or sell any medical product without third-party interference. Your body, your choice. That's how you'd get an FDA-free zone, analysis of parallel societies. Now we see why a focused moral critique is so important. It combines A, the moral fervor of a political movement, with B, the laser focus of a startup company, into C, a one-commandment-based startup society. Such a society is not a total revolution. We aren't starting completely de novo. Each startup society is simply taking a broken aspect of today's world, often a state-caused or at least state-neglected calamity, writing the history of that state failure, and then building an opt-in community to solve the problem. It's a tightly focused parallel society making one impactful change. Why not more than one commandment? Why is it so important to introduce one commandment rather than 0 or n? The short answer is that you don't want to write something as complex as a social operating system from scratch, and in fact others will prevent you from doing so. But you also don't want to avoid innovating on a broken society. So introducing one tightly focused change at a time in a startup society with opt-in citizens allows testing of the new commandment. The longer answer revolves around an important paradox of modern society, namely that many people feel uncomfortable evangelizing religious morals, yet very comfortable evangelizing their political ethics. The first part is easy to understand. Westerners are nowadays often shy about telling others to practice their religion. Why? They may feel they haven't figured it all out, so who are they to say? Or they know they can't live up to their ideal moral code, like someone who wants to diet but can't always restrain themselves, so they refrain from commentary to avoid the charge of hypocrisy. They also may not want to be attacked as a crazy cult leader. All of these are understandable hesitations for either A, evangelizing a traditional religion, B, inventing a wholly new one, or C, forking an existing religion. The last is kind of like starting a new denomination of Protestantism, where you keep much of the old code base, but add in some crucial distinctive factors. But think about the second part. While there is great hesitation in Western society around religious evangelism, there is seemingly no hesitation around political evangelism. Indeed, this is considered an ethical duty, usually in exactly those terms, with the word ethical used in place of moral, but serving a very similar role, and with at least two large competing political parties fighting for the souls or votes of their believers. Therein lies the paradox. While political and religious movements can both be considered doctrines, in that they come packaged with a number of directives on how people must live, the same person who is shy about telling other people about morality is often incredibly confident when yelling at other people about politics. That's why we advise one commandment for your new startup society. It's something in between being too shy and too overbearing. It's in between avoiding religious-sounding evangelism entirely and indulging in political-sounding evangelism too much. Don't avoid taking a moral stance, because that means you passively succumb to your surroundings. But also don't try imposing an all-encompassing political ideology to start, because that's too hard and means total warfare with your surroundings. Instead, just pick one flaw in modern society that you do feel confident in building a startup society to redress, and go with that. One commandment, not 0 or n. What about older doctrines? So far we've talked about a one commandment, but implied it is a new moral innovation, like cutting out sugar or limiting internet use. What about older religions, political codes, and moral commandments? You can certainly return to an older known religious code, adopting it in whole or in part. In a startup society where everyone opts in, you can make this happen more easily because religion in many countries is mostly about private practice. So long as people agree in a peer-to-peer fashion to practice their religion a certain way, the state allows them to do it. It's harder to return to an older political code because you are now talking about public law rather than private law. Still, if you build a large enough startup society and pick the right laws, there is probably something at the town, city, or province level that you can do. either within the West or outside it. Parallel systems catalyze peaceful reform. How did the US beat the USSR? Because it built and defended a parallel system. Rewind back to how the Soviet Union fell. As Stephen Kotkin noted in a brilliant interview, the most important fact about the Soviet Union was that they genuinely were communists. Outsiders perceived the Soviets to be cynical, but they were wrong. Their cynicism had limits. At the end of the day, the Soviets were devout believers in their ideology. How could it be otherwise? Soviet citizens weren't stupid, and people knew there were things that didn't add up, but they were operating within a constrained information environment. The censorship was so pervasive that it controlled thought. The degree of self-deception was so all-encompassing that even the nomenclatura like Boris Yeltsin didn't know how truly poor the Soviet Union was till he visited an American supermarket and threw up his hands at how far behind the USSR was. Unlike Orwell's O'Brien, the Soviet leaders deceived themselves too. So fundamentally, any proposed edits by Soviet elites to the USSR would have been just on the margins. They were information and values constrained. They actually needed a totally different system. Yet their system resisted both revolutionary and incremental reform. The solution was the parallel system of the United States, an alternative society starting from different moral premises that eventually produced undeniably better results. That's the same basic thing that reformed the People's Republic of China. The mere existence of successful parallel systems in Taiwan, Hong Kong, and especially Singapore is what drove Deng Xiaoping to adopt capitalism. Ezra Vogel's book is excellent on this. So in both cases, it was a parallel system that beat the Soviet system and the Maoist system. Parallel systems once required contiguous land, now they don't. In the 20th century, the only way to build a parallel system was to fight and win a war, often a hot one, against the communists or fascists who were intent on conquering your territory. The parallel systems of the US and Singapore, Hong Kong, and Taiwan were maintained against the USSR and PRC at enormous cost by fighting for large contiguous regions of land. That was a very state-centric approach. In the 21st century, our approach suggests a network-centric way to build parallel systems. Create one opt-in society at a time, purely digitally if need be, justifying it with a historical and moral critique of the present system that delegitimizes state violence against them and allows the experiment to continue. Many will fail. But for those that succeed, we can merge together the good changes and discard the bad ones, and eventually get a parallel society that differs in many respects from, say, the original US code base, but that maintains enough similarity that it's backwards compatible, and citizens can migrate over. Much like the relation of the USA to Europe during the 1800s, this is a way to reproducibly build a new world on the internet to reform existing states. 4 points on 1 commandments. Let's review. First, by starting with a seemingly simple moral premise and taking to its logical conclusion, a one-commandment-based startup society ends up changing huge swaths of life, but in a focused, exit-constrained, and intellectually consistent way. Just think about what keto really means when it's extrapolated out to the scale of an entire town, and sugar poisoning is taken as seriously as lead poisoning. Second, one-commandment-based societies allow for scalable, parallel, consensual exploration of socio-political space. Different groups that disagree with each other on how to live can nevertheless support the meta-concept of many different one-commandment-based experiments. And indeed, both a carnivore community and vegan village would likely have better health outcomes than the default Western diet, even if these communities disagree on core moral premises. Third, there's a network effect between societies. Each starts off highly focused, of course. Much as a startup company tries to attract customers with a single focused product, each startup society tries to attract subscribers with a single focused commandment. And as with a startup company, any individual experiment towards a new socio-political order may succeed or fail. But so long as some one-commandment-based startup societies succeed, they can copy each other's proven moral innovations. Fourth, each of these one-commandment-based startup societies is supported by a history. Listen to someone from the Keto Kosher Society and they'll be able to rattle off an account of how the USDA food pyramid led to epidemic obesity. Chat with a Benedictine option monk and you'll hear about the religious culture they're trying to preserve. And talk to a citizen of the post-FDA society, and they'll give you a history of the few strengths and many weaknesses of the FDA from ACT UP to drug lag. Some such societies are focused on new technologies and some are not, but all of them are based on an ethical code premised on their reading of history. And that's why history is the foundation of any new startup society. Chapter 3. The Tripolar Moment. NYT, CCP, BTC. Today's world is becoming tripolar. It is NYT versus CCP versus BTC. That's the American establishment versus the Communist Party of China versus the global internet. Each of these three poles has a source of truth online. Paper, NYT, party, CCP, or protocol, Bitcoin. Each has a digital economy that surrounds that source of truth. The dollar economy, the digital yuan, or the Web3 crypto economy. Each pole is a network in its own right, which stands outside the state. The NYT network gives direction to the American state. The CCP network leads the Chinese state, and the Bitcoin network stands outside all states. And each has a governing ideology. Woke capital is the ideology of America's ruling class as explicated by America's ruling newspaper, the New York Times. It's capitalism that enables decentralized censorship, cancel culture, and American empire. It's drone strike democracy. Communist capital is the ideology of the Chinese Communist Party. It's capitalism checked by the centralized power of the Chinese party state, as summarized here. Leninist, Confucianist, capitalist, and nationalist. Crypto capital is the international ideology of Bitcoin and Web3. It's stateless capitalism, capitalism without corporations, decentralized censorship resistance, and neutral international law. And it's the second pole within both the US and China, the one that domestic regime opponents align around. While superficial aspects of these ideologies may shift with circumstance, we claim these are the only coalitions with the billion-person scale and technological talent to survive as independent power centers in the all-out digital struggle that has already commenced. They do have internal divisions, as we'll get to, but for the time being, every group from companies to states to dissident factions within states will have to navigate between these poles, the tripolar triangle of the digital world, the dated and the timeless. Before we go further, let's note, anything written about current events is, by its nature, likely to become dated. It is possible, even likely, that the US establishment sheds its skin once again, downplaying wokeness and emphasizing loyalty to the state, just as they transitioned overnight from the global war on terror to the domestic war on your tweets. It is possible, although less likely, that George Soros, Peter Zeihan, Gordon Chang, and Roger Garside eventually prove right, that Xi Jinping is displaced from his position atop the Communist Party of China in the 2022 Party Congress, and or that the CCP switches back to hide your strength and bide your time. And it is possible, although less likely still, that there is some fatal flaw, mathematical breakthrough, or quantum computer that leads to the irreparable failure of the Bitcoin protocol. So why devote a chapter to the NYT, CCP, BTC model at all, if events can overtake it? 3 reasons. First, we need some model of where the world is, even if imperfect, to steer it where we want to go. Even if it's wrong or wrong in some particulars, it may be usefully wrong in that the update shows us where we were wrong. We spend the energy to describe a specific tripolar model of the world because many still think it's unipolar or bipolar, as illustrated by this amusing interaction between a journalist and Indian Foreign Minister S. Jaishankar. Second, even if major changes do occur, the decline of American empire, the rise of China, and the ascent of cryptocurrency remain underlying trends involving hundreds of millions of people that would require tremendous force to stop. We'd notice. And we consider a few candidates for such tremendous forces later. Third, there are aspects of the current moment that are not dated at all, but recurrent. That is, a similar tripolar configuration has occurred before. But first, let's establish how it came about today. A bipolar America and a tripolar triangle. In 1990, as the USSR was clearly falling apart, Charles Krauthammer wrote an influential essay called The Unipolar Moment. It made the point that with the Cold War at an end, the US was the sole dominant power on the planet, and would be for roughly a generation, after which point multipolarity will come in time. This thesis held up well. Unipolarity was true in the 1990s, mostly true in the 2000s, much less true with the rise of Asia, technology, and American polarization in the 2010s, and no longer true in the 2020s. As of 2022, we no longer have a unipolar world, nor is it just ambiguously multipolar with an unspecified number of power centers. Instead, we have a bipolar America and a tripolar triangle, and we can visualize these poles as follows. Name, communist capital, economically moderate authoritarian, mandate, you must submit. Source of truth, Chinese Communist Party, economy, renminbi or Chinese yuan. Hirschman value, loyalty, strength, hard power, Western or Eastern, state or network, state, legitimacy, harmony, themes, loyalty, unity, technopolitics, artificial intelligence, leadership, one leader. Name, woke capital, economically left libertarian, mandate, you must sympathize. Source of truth, New York Times, economy, United States dollar, Hirschman value, voice, strength, soft power, Western or Eastern, state or network, state, legitimacy, left democracy, themes, elections, protests, technopolitics, social, leadership, few leaders, name, crypto capital, economically right libertarian, mandate, you must be sovereign, source of truth, Bitcoin, economy, Web 3, Hirschman value, exit, strength, hard money, Western or Eastern, global, state or network, legitimacy, right democracy, themes, markets, migration, technopolitics, crypto, leadership, no leaders, moral power, martial power, money power. In the mid-20th century, the decline of the British Empire presaged a three-way fight between a moral power, a martial power, and a money power, roughly left versus right versus center. Back then, the Soviet Union was the moral power, the Nazis were the military power, and the Americans were the money power. Today, NYT is the moral power, CCP is the martial power, and Bitcoin is the money power. In each case, we also find that the moral power plants molds for espionage, the martial power excels at manufacturing, and the money power leads in media. But while in the mid-20th century these three powers were states, today they are primarily networks. Moral state, martial state, money state. Back up for a second. How could we possibly say that an entity like the USSR, which killed millions of people, was a moral power? Because the USSR's primary strategy was communist proselytization, the unceasing evangelism of a malign but convincing moral doctrine that managed to capture more than a third of the Earth's population by mid-century. It did have a colossal military but spoke endlessly of peace. It seized everyone's property but claimed it didn't care about money, and its self-image was that of saintly selflessness. It is in this sense that the Soviet Union was a moral power. Its moral power allowed it to plant moles in every country, which compensated for its lack of money and manufacturing. American sympathizers funded the build-out of the Soviet state, handed it diplomatic recognition, distracted Japan on its behalf, supplied it with the Lend-Lease Act during World War II and nuclear weapons afterward, and generally propped up the USSR throughout its life. Nazi Germany also infamously murdered millions of people. While similar to the USSR in many respects, its primary strategy was different. It was an emphasis on martial valor, on pure brute force, on the shells that would supposedly hiss louder than any mere words. It did have an inescapable propaganda apparatus, but its moral preaching was martial. It did leave some money-oriented businesses intact, but said it was socialist. Its raison d'etre was ruthless self-interest. It is in this sense that Nazi Germany was a martial power. To support this martial power, the Germans needed a tremendous manufacturing build-out, which they accomplished. Many historians believe the German military had, on a pound-for-pound basis, the best equipment in the war. But because they lacked the capitalists' ability to cooperate across borders, they drove away some of their best scientists prior to murdering others, ensuring they'd never gain the atomic bomb. And because their morality amounted to Aryan supremacy, which didn't appeal to anyone other than their co-ethnics, they never managed to build a large enough global coalition to win, which is why the 70 million Germans were eventually beaten by the 50 million British, the 150 million Americans, and the 150 million Soviets. As for the mid-century Americans, their primary strategy was democratic capitalism, as opposed to Soviet communism or National Socialism. They preached a morality but framed it in terms of a capitalist-friendly four freedoms. They built an arsenal of democracy, but it arose from their commercial-industrial base. It is in this sense that World War II America was a money power. Accompanying the money power was media power, just as capitalism went with democracy. The Americans were much better at media than the Nazis, who couldn't argue in English, and incrementally better than the Soviets, whose propaganda was ultimately undermined by their lack of prosperity. The media battle was a close-run thing, but in the end, blue jeans outcompeted the Red Army. So, in this tripolar configuration, after a titanic struggle, the money power in the center did end up winning over both the martial power on the right by 1945 and the moral power on the left by 1991. Moral network, martial network, money network. Today, the decline of the US empire has led to the rise of a moral power represented by NYT, a martial power, CCP, and a money power, BTC. The difference relative to mid-century is that each of these are networks that are upstream of states, rather than primarily states themselves. NYT, the moral network. The NYT-centered network of journalists holds power to account and thereby stands above any mere elected government. Its go-to tactics are moral badgering and mole-driven espionage, just like the Soviet Union. On the moral point, go back and look at any recent NYT headline and note how many of the articles involve a moral rather than factual premise as the core point. Free speech is bad, white people are bad, communism was good. This is the kind of thing they are focused on. And it is in this sense that NYT is a moral power. On the espionage point, as just discussed, we know that the Soviets were past masters at subversion. Their moral convictions made them feel that invading the privacy of others, stealing secrets, destroying lives with Zerzitzung, all of that was acceptable for the great moral cause of communism. Because they weren't as good at building as the US or even Germany, the Soviet munitions came from America via Lend-Lease. Stealing and destroying was the best thing they could do. Sulzberger's employees and American journalists in general are similar. They're the Stasi with a stock symbol, the original surveillance capitalists. It's always phrased in the passive voice, but how exactly did the New York Times obtain the things they print? The story behind the story is more interesting than the story, and the behind-the-scenes footage would show you a different movie than the one they want you to watch. In short, much like the communists, the journalists' moral conviction gives them the license to dox private citizens, to go through people's garbage, to use secret identities and then claim they don't, to print hacked data, to solicit leaks of private information while demanding to keep their own information private, to induce people to break contracts, to stalk people at their homes, even to cover up enormous genocides and start giant wars, always in the service of the bottom line and some purported higher good. The establishment journalist claims to speak truth to power, but somehow never gets around to investigating themselves or each other. As Bloomberg admitted in a moment of candor, they report on but do not investigate Reuters and CNBC because they are direct rivals. We occasionally hear about incidents like the episode where ABC got CBS to fire the Robach leaker, or when NBC tried to stifle Ronan Farrow's work. But those are just the tip of the iceberg. There's an enormous incentive for establishment journalists to engage in anti-competitive collusion because if they all agree on what is true, who can then fact-check them? No one can hold accountable those with the power to hold the government accountable. CCP, the Marshall Network. This one may require the most explanation as it's the most foreign to Western experience. First, we'll describe why CCP is primarily a network, and then why it's now mainly Marshall. We don't pretend to be China experts, few are, but these are relatively basic points that are still not that well known. Why is CCP a network? The CCP network of party members is less separate from the Chinese state, as it doesn't pretend to be at a great remove from the levers of power as NYT does. But the party is not the same as the state. Indeed, there are 95 million CCP members, and they don't all have senior government positions any more than every registered Democrat has a plum spot in the Biden administration. Instead, they are spread out through society. How does it work? Joining the CCP is itself non-trivial, which selects for the most dedicated members. The South China Morning Post outlines the arduous application process. An application must be filed to the applicant's closest party committee or branch with a letter explaining why he is applying for membership, why he believes in the Communist Party, and areas in which he feels he has fallen short of the requirement to become a member. But it doesn't end there, according to Merrick's. Applicants must write essays on Marxism-Leninism and on current political developments. 8 colleagues, neighbors, and acquaintances have to vouch for an applicant's reputation. After applying, the applicant must take courses and then pass an exam, only to then be put into a year-long, at least, probationary period. The applicant will then attend party courses, where he will learn about the party's constitution, after which he will have to take and pass written tests. Upon passing the tests, the applicant will require to submit more materials to the party branch, including personal information of himself and his parents. Information about his employment and his parents' political affiliations also have to be disclosed. Probationary party membership will be granted upon passing the screening, being recommended by 2 party members, and discussions and approval after a meeting with the party branch. Probation lasts at least a year. At the end of the probation period, the party branch decides whether to admit the applicant, extend the probation, or expel him. Lest one misbehave during the probationary period, there are consequences if the applicant does not behave up to strict standards. In the ensuing 1-year probation period, the admission process can still be stopped if party discipline is breached. And if you are finally cleared by the party to join, you have a lifelong commitment to uphold, as Mo Chen writes. When the CCP hold a top-tier meeting, you will be in your local party branch conference room to watch it live and write essay on thoughts after view. Natural disasters happen, donate, mandatory. Oh, you don't know where to find the donation box? Don't worry, it is deducted already from your salary. Every time the chairman of China releases important article address the issues of current affairs and overarching strategy for the next 5 years, you write that article 10 times, handwritten, due tomorrow. Thankfully, these are like once every 5 years. If you break the law, no matter how small, you get a party internal warning post. And yes, you write a reflection essay about what had led you astray and how wrong you realize you are. If it is serious, you are back to probation period. Even more serious, the double policy, you lose both your party status and office title. Seems very alien to a Western mindset. What people would choose to constantly post new essays regurgitating the latest in regime propaganda and indoctrinating their co-workers and family members? But it all fits if you think of them as China's New York Times subscribers. Think about this scene in Team America. World Police, where the Janine Garofalo figure says, as actors, it is our responsibility to read the newspapers and then say what we read on television like it's our own opinion. Then just swap out the NYT mobile app with Shuiqi Changguo. As the saying goes, party, government, army, society, and education, east, west, south, and north, the party leads on everything. It's almost the same for the American establishment, except the paper leads on everything. America's CCP are its NPCs. Why is CCP Marshall? From 1978 to 2013, from Deng Xiaoping to Jiang Zemin to Hu Jintao, the CCP was focused on economic growth. But under Xi Jinping, it's taken a turn towards militarist nationalism. It builds most of the world's physical products. Its military budget is already greater than 1/3 that of America's. It has a more focused task, reunify China rather than police the world. It produces military recruiting videos like We Will Always Be Here, and most importantly, it is investing heavily in AI and drones. On that last point, China is just better at deployment in the physical world than the US government or military, as we can see from A, the public infrastructure comparison, B, the multi-billion-dollar failures of the American Ford-class aircraft carrier, the F-35 manned aircraft, the littoral combat ship, and the Zumwalt destroyer, and C, the fact that all the manufacturing know-how and the factories themselves are in China. Robotics could shift manufacturing out of China, but until then it is quite possible that the arsenal of democracy is more like the arsenal of communism. Note, however, that just because China becomes primarily a martial power does not mean it will necessarily win a physical conflict. The Nazis, too, in our framework, were primarily a martial power and did not win. Then again, while the Nazis were outnumbered by the US, UK, and USSR by a 5-to-1 ratio, 70 million to 350 million, the Chinese outnumbered the Americans by a roughly 4-to-1 ratio, 1.4 billion to 330 million, so past performance may not be predictive of future results. BTC, the money network. This one is almost too obvious, so we won't belabor it. The global network of Bitcoin holders in a key sense also stands above states. Like the NYT network stands above the American state and the CCP network stands above the Chinese state. Why? Because it's very hard for states to seize Bitcoin in the absence of some kind of quantum computing breakthrough. But it's primarily a money power rather than a moral power like NYT or a martial power like CCP. The less obvious point is that Bitcoin and its adjacent group of Web3 users are becoming a media power that will eventually topple the NYT, much as the 20th century US's media power eventually outcompeted that of the Soviet Union. Why? Decentralized media. You can see early signs of this with Substack, Mirror, and NFTs, but in brief, the best content creators have better things to do than work for the establishment. They can become publishers of their own by founding their own media companies. As with the CCP's transition to a martial power, the Bitcoin and Web3 transition to a money and media power is not at all conventional wisdom. Overlaps and exceptions. Of course, these aren't pure forms. NYT is a publicly traded multi-billion-dollar corporation and is certainly able to influence the Fed and other huge flows of money, and it can spur much of the US military into action with a fake article or three. So it has money and martial power, even if it is primarily a moral power. CCP endlessly preaches to its citizens via Shueqi Tiangguo, and until recently was focused entirely on business. So it has a moral and money power as well, though it is becoming primarily a martial power. Finally, Bitcoin certainly makes a set of implicit moral arguments. Inflation is bad, centralization is bad, pseudonymity is good, and the like. And it has a martial power, though it's entirely defensive, as the combination of encryption and physical decentralization render it resistant to 20th century style military attacks. But it is perhaps obviously fundamentally a money power. One can do a similar exercise for the US, USSR, and NSDAP triangle. Submission, sympathy, sovereignty. Each pole legitimizes themselves by appealing to a societally useful concept and takes it to an extreme as part of denouncing its opposite extreme. The CCP is the most obvious. You must submit. They're the Chinese Communist Party and they're powerful, so you must bow your head. This is very simple and straightforward and easy to understand, though it only really works for them within China and the Chinese internet. The NYT pole is slightly more subtle. They demand you must sympathize. After all, aren't you white or male or straight or CIS or abled or wealthy, or a member of one of an ever-multiplying number of privileged categories, and therefore an oppressor on some dimension? Because you're powerful, you must sympathize and bow your head to those you have ostensibly oppressed. It's a left-handed version of the submission ideology. It can get anyone to bow their head in the name of empowering them, because 99.99% of the world is an oppressor on at least some dimension. This pole is strongest on the English-speaking internet, weakest on the Chinese internet, and of intermediate strength outside that. The Bitcoin pole is the opposite of both of these. It demands you must be sovereign. That means rather than bending to the CCP or slitting your wrists as NYT demands, you hold your head up high, you hold your private keys locally, you don't trust centralized corporations or governments, you're self-sufficient and autarkic, you're living off the grid. This pole is strong on the global internet, though it's facing pushback from both CCP and NYT. Extremes and counter-extremes are undesirable. The subtlety here is that each of these poles has an element of truth to it. You don't want a CCP society where everyone has no recourse but to submit, because that can easily become a now-digital totalitarianism. On the other hand, you also don't want a society where no one submits to anyone, because that looks like San Francisco, where people can run into Walgreens and steal everything. You don't want the NYT-run society where everyone has no recourse but to sympathize with the current thing, because that results in what Matt Iglesias has called the Great Awakening, the emotive and irrational breakdowns that set America on fire and continue to roil U.S. society. Yet you also don't want the society where no one sympathizes, because that looks like the Grand Theft Auto environment of 1990s Russia, the low-trust post-communist society where any cooperative endeavor is regarded as a scam. Finally, and perhaps least obviously, you don't want the society where everyone must be sovereign, because taken to its irrational limit, that means pumping your own water from out of the ground, growing your own food, not trusting any vendor or person other than yourself, and generally ending the division of labor that makes capitalism run. Extreme autarky might sound romantic, but in the absence of robotic breakthroughs, going truly off-grid is a recipe for dramatic regression in the standard of living. Conversely, of course, you don't want a society where no one has the possibility of being sovereign at all, as this leaves us all subject to the not-so-incipient digital totalitarianism that CCP has already rolled out and NYT wishes it could. A re-centralized center. One might argue, and I would agree, that while these three poles and their opposite three extremes are bad, they are not all equally bad, and you don't necessarily need to be dead center. For example, I'd personally err much closer to the sovereignty pole than our current culture, and try to develop the technologies to enable this. However, we should recognize that different strokes will suit different folks. And rather than trying to impose preferences on everyone, what we really want are a variety of points in between these three undesirable poles. Different fusions for different groups. The construction we outline in this book, the startup society that ultimately becomes a network state, ideally combines aspects of all three. For example, it does have a clear founder to provide direction, but it ensures every citizen has the right to freely leave should they choose, that coin holders also have a say, and a number of other digital checks and balances. This concept is the basis of the re-centralized center, an idea we discuss in depth later. Conflicts and alliances. A tripolar triangle leads to surprisingly complicated dynamics. During the Great Depression, FDR's US admired the Nazis, and the NYT wrote encomiums to them, as documented in 3 New Deals, and the Grey Lady winked. Then, after the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the USSR and the Nazis kicked off World War II by invading Poland together, with the USSR standing by as the Nazis fought the Anglo-Americans, and the US-aligned UK seriously contemplating bombing the Soviets. Later, the USSR and the Nazis fought each other during Barbarossa. Then the US and the USSR teamed up to fight the Nazis. Finally, the US and USSR split Germany between themselves and fought each other during the Cold War. That's why Orwell wrote in 1984 about how Oceania had always been at war with Eurasia, because the coalitions between states switched all the time. With networks rather than states, the coalitions are even more fluid, with several existing simultaneously. One pole against another, NYT versus CCP. This is the obvious one, the Thucydides trap, the great power conflict between the US and China that many have predicted. But there's a subtlety here. Many regular Chinese people don't want such a conflict, and many Americans don't either. But those who are invested in imperial ambitions on both sides, the paper subscribers and the party members, are into it. Networks are driving the states to war. NYT versus Bitcoin. This is another obvious one. The American regulatory state, which NYT is upstream of, against the decentralized network. We are seeing this push with efforts like the failed 2021 House bill and the concerned tech letter. Note the demographics of the signatories to the latter. It is almost entirely white Westerners complaining about the US establishment losing root control over the global financial system. It is doubtful that their enthusiasm for the dollar will be shared by Americans hit by inflation, or by people overseas. This conflict is the American establishment versus the global internet. CCP versus Bitcoin. Yet another obvious one. The CCP has banned Bitcoin many times over the years, but those bans have materially grown in severity. The most recent action was just short of a seizure. 2 poles versus the third, NYT plus CCP versus Bitcoin. This is the state versus the network. It's when the NYT-controlled American empire and the CCP-controlled Chinese empire team up to attack Bitcoin, perhaps on the grounds of climate or some other thinly veiled excuse to maintain state power. NYT plus Bitcoin versus CCP. This is Western voice and exit together versus Eastern control. It's when NYT's interests in disrupting the Chinese regime and Bitcoin's interests in providing globally uncensorable savings overlap to provide a thorn in the side for CCP. The Web3 part of Bitcoin and Web3 becomes particularly important here, because it provides hard-to-censor global services that complement digital gold, which on its own is necessary but not sufficient for freedom. Bitcoin plus CCP versus NYT. This is the post-American world against the American empire. Against the inflating dollar, China and crypto together can do something neither can alone. The CCP/RMB pole runs a Chinese system that is already at scale, capable of operating completely outside the dollar, and based on a more modern digital yuan to boot. The Bitcoin and Web3 part of this aligns American dissidents with global crypto holders and promotes neutral protocols that take away American root access, but also don't grant it to China. Intrapolar conflicts. Near each pole there is an internal dyad representing the conflict within. We represent this as an inscribed triangle within the tripolar triangle. Near the NYT pole are the American dissidents, the non-woke liberals, centrists and conservatives who disagree with the US establishment's platform of speech controls, inflation and unending warfare, but still identify as American first and don't want to see China become number one. Near the CCP pole are the Chinese liberals, the internationalist capitalists who thought times were better under Hu, as well as the many groups left and right who've seen their fortunes dim under newly aggressive Chinese nationalism, but again, who still see themselves as Chinese first and don't want to bend to American imperialism. Near the Bitcoin pole is the Web3 community and the tens of millions of Bitcoin holders who don't identify as maximalists, but who also still subscribe to many of the internationalist principles that presuppose an internet without American or Chinese root control over the financial or communication systems. The road to re-centralization. And what about other countries and people who don't define themselves with reference to the Americans, the Chinese, or the blockchain? Well, there will be a lot of pressure to identify with the first two poles, which will drive any group that doesn't want to be under the thumb of the US establishment or the CCP to the third pole of Bitcoin and Web3. That is, one of our premises is that the Indians, Israelis, American dissidents, Chinese liberals, tech founders and investors, and people from other countries that want to maintain their own sovereignty will need to avail themselves of Bitcoin and Web3 for decentralized communication, transaction, and computation. But to fully explain why, we'll need to go through a scenario for the future that isn't about remaining under the thumb of US or Chinese centralization, nor about falling into crypto-anarchic decentralization, but rather about consciously re-centralizing into opt-in startup societies. Chapter 4. Decentralization, re-centralization, the possible futures. It's not about the future, it's about the possible futures. Why? Because causality exists. Because we can run controlled experiments. Because human action can influence outcomes. Because we aren't communists that believe in the historical inevitability of utopian outcomes, but technologists that believe in individual initiatives subject to practical constraints. The previous two chapters were about those constraints, about the past and the immediate present. They orient us to discuss several possible futures before picking out one trajectory to focus on. The one where we materialize many startup societies, get a few diplomatically recognized as network states, and rebuild high-trust societies via a re-centralized center. Some caveats before we begin, though. When it comes to the past, every history is inevitably just a story. That is, any tale of the past is necessarily abridged, abbreviated, edited, and idiosyncratic. You can't convey 5,000 years of written records any other way, and our tale of history as trajectory is no different. It's like the why now slide at the beginning of every entrepreneur's deck. A practical history of particular events that lead to the feasibility of the network state. But we cited our references so you can check our facts. On the topic of the present, our chapter on the tripolar moment is the section of the book that is likely to be the most dated. Intentionally so because we endeavored to move most references to current or near past events to this section. So think of that chapter as being very much a worldview circa mid-2022. Like the Kalman filter, we reserve the right to incorporate new information to update it. Now to the subject of the future. As you'll see, we do believe a re-centralized center of pragmatic network states can emerge and describe several scenarios where this could happen. But our projections are just scenarios, and throughout we keep in mind volatility, reflexivity, competing curves, and the consequent limits to predictability. First, volatility is rising because the internet increases variance. Social media is social volatility, go viral or get cancelled, and cryptocurrency is financial volatility, go to the moon or get wrecked. Volatility makes correct predictions more difficult but offers upside for those who predict correctly, and volatility is good for insurgents and bad for incumbents because the former only need to get lucky once while the latter need to keep staying lucky. It's no longer just individuals that are subject to high volatility, as entire countries can rise and fall overnight. So in a high volatility environment, only Bezos-style invariants remain constant. All other observations should be taken as tentative. They are true until they are suddenly not. Reflexivity is Soros's term for the feedback loop between participants' understanding of a situation and the situation in which they participate. In systems made of human beings, putting something out into the world results in a reaction, and then a reaction to that reaction, and so on, often resulting in positive and negative feedback loops rather than textbook convergence to equilibria. Thus, when collecting data on such systems, let alone forecasting them, one must keep in mind that people will react to predictions themselves, sometimes to make them come true. In social science, unlike physical science, every row in a data set represents a human being with a mind of their own. The concept of competing curves refers to the fact that there are many simultaneous technopolitical movements competing at the present moment, different phenomena rising from zero to affect millions over the course of years, months, or even days. For example, if you take a look at this graph of how people met their spouses, you can see several different curves rising and falling as different cultural movements come online, until the internet just dominates everything. Another example is the market share of social networks over time. A third is Ray Dalio's graph of the rise and fall of nations. The point is that you can identify the players, but not always the outcome, in a complex multi-actor process. Applying this to our scenario analysis, we have some trends that are synergistic and others that are antagonistic. For example, many trend leans point to diminished American power, but at least one points in the other direction. The West's willingness to weaponize its tech giants for domestic and foreign conflicts alike. Does this give American dominance another few years, another decade, or many more than that? We can identify the curves, but not always which ones win out. Predictability has its limits. In our view, there are two kinds of predictions that matter: the physical and the financial. The physical prediction is a very specific bet on the trajectory of a ball, on a genomic base core, or on the electron configuration of an orbital. It's checked by reproducible experiment, and your device fails if it fails. The financial prediction is at the opposite end of the spectrum. It's a macroscopic bet on the volatile, reflexive behavior of other human beings. It's checked by the unforgiving market, and your fund fails if it fails. We aren't as interested in betting on manipulation-prone government statistics. According to the Chinese government of 2021, the number of COVID deaths in China from mid-2020 to 2022 was 0. According to the San Francisco government of 2021, the crime rate in SF was declining. According to the US establishment of 2021, the inflation of the dollar was transitory. All this reminds us of the Soviet government of 1932, who said the harvest in Ukraine was glorious. As we discuss later, it is useful to create on-chain shadow statistics that are more verifiable, reliable, and censorship-resistant than these easily faked indicators. But outside of that, predictions on official government statistics are otherwise uninteresting because of how obviously political they are. So we steer clear of that kind of thing. In our analysis of possible futures, we'll either predict something as technologically and hence physically feasible, or that it could result in a financial return, or both. And we'll give recipes for how to make those predictions reality, or prevent them from becoming reality in the form of fictional scenarios on good and bad futures. So to recap, our history is just a story, our analysis of the present may presently be dated, and our forecasts for the future may be confounded by volatility, reflexivity, competing curves, and the limits of predictability. With that said, all models are wrong, but some are useful. So with caveats catalogued and provisos provided, let's proceed. Analytical axes and scenario analyses. We start by describing new lenses to view the world in the sections on socio-political and techno-economic axes. These are mental models that hopefully help compress large amounts of data into rough patterns. Next, in the section on foreseeable futures, we put on our tech investor hats and project out into the near future, describing developments we anticipate. These aren't just random investment theses, though. They're pieces of the future that are relevant to startup societies and network states. We then game out one specific science fiction scenario in detail that we think is unfortunately quite plausible. American anarchy, Chinese control, and the international intermediate. In this scenario, we project a second American Civil War triggered in part by a broke U.S. government that attempts Bitcoin seizures, a situation we call American anarchy. Unlike the first Civil War, this would be a stochastic struggle between two networks, rather than an explicit dispute between two states. It would be more undeclared than declared, more invisible than legible, and this conflict could end in decentralization and disunion instead of centralization and consolidation. As radical as that sounds, many thinkers from across the political spectrum already foresee something like this happening in different ways, including Stephen March, David Rehoboy, Barbara Walter, and Kurt Schlichter, though like me, none of them are particularly happy about the prospect. Meanwhile, in this fictional scenario, the CCP implements an intense domestic crackdown on the other side of the world to maintain stability, preventing Chinese people from freely leaving the digital yuan network with their property, a result we refer to as Chinese control. As America descends into anarchy, the CCP points to their functional but highly unfree system as the only alternative, and exports a turnkey version of their surveillance state to other countries as the next version of Belt and Road, as a piece of infrastructure that comes complete with a SaaS subscription to China's all-seeing AI eye. In the name of putting a lid on the anarchy and restoring democracy, the U.S. establishment then silently copies CCP's methodology without admitting they're doing so, much as they cloned China's lockdown after loudly denouncing it. Similarly, after spending a decade pretending to decry surveillance capitalism, the U.S. establishment formally deputizes many big tech companies as official arms of the surveillance state. However, the establishment's implementation of this digital lockdown is as tragicomic as the CCP's version is totalitarian, and is porous enough to permit serious resistance. Strong form and weak form models of the future. This is the world we could be barreling towards. You don't have to believe in it to found a startup society, though, so why talk about it at all then? Because in a high volatility time, it's worth thinking through models of how our future could be very different from our present. Think of the American anarchy versus Chinese Control-L scenario as a strong form model of how NYT, Bitcoin, and CCP could collide, with startup societies and network states arising out of that atom smasher as deliberately created alternatives to wokeness, maximalism, and Chinese communism. The weak form model is that things don't work out precisely this way. Few things do. But that the general trend is correct. That is, in the future, the U.S. establishment does lose relative control, the CCP does try to exert absolute control, and Bitcoin maximalists do advocate for no control. The way of life propounded by each of these ideological communities will get extreme, but will also be itself justified as a reaction to the other two perceived extremes. As discussed in extremes and counter-extremes are undesirable. So we'll still need to build societies with consciously chosen trade-offs between submission, sympathy, and sovereignty, instead of unconsciously capitulating to either an extreme or counter-extreme. And that again leads us to startup societies and network states. So using the strong form scenario as a base, we discuss a number of victory conditions and surprise endings for different factions. We also give a bit more detail on the desired outcome, the trajectory we want to shoot for. A re-centralized center of high-trust societies. Building the future rather than defaulting into it. Our goal in thinking all this through is not pessimistic but pragmatic. To change what we can change by setting up a fourth pole as an alternative to the failing U.S. establishment, to maximalist crypto-anarchy, and to the centralized surveillance state of the CCP. We call the raw material for this fourth pole the international intermediate. It includes American centrists, Chinese liberals, Indians, Israelis, Web3 technologists, and essentially everyone from around the world that wants to avoid both the American and Chinese whirlpools. At first blush, this group represents approximately 80% of the world population and has little in common save their disinclination towards both anarchy and tyranny. But a subset of them will be smart enough to realize that exit is a stopgap, not a solution. People tend to imitate what they see, And if American anarchy and Chinese control are the most prominent games in town, they will eventually be imitated. So isolationism is off the table. Yet so is direct intervention, as both the American and Chinese theaters will snarl against any outside interference. The answer then is innovation, rather than isolationism or interventionism. A subset of the international intermediate needs to build something better than both American anarchy and Chinese control, a concrete improvement over the propaganda, coercion, surveillance, and conflict that may soon characterize the two pillars of the global economy. In other words, the rest of the world will need to lead. They can't hope for the U.S. establishment or CCP to figure it out. And that's the re-centralized center, a circle of startup societies and network states built by pragmatic founders, a group of high-trust communities architected as intentional alternatives to failed states and surveillance states alike. Sociopolitical axes, old mental models for understanding the world, are quickly going out of date. Not only are things changing faster, things are changing faster on new dimensions. New socio-political axes are emerging. Seeing the world through old lenses risks being caught blindsided by the political equivalent of a runaway truck. People who thought the financial crisis of 2008 was unthinkable just weren't looking at the right graphs. Michael Berry was, though. In the same spirit, what are some new graphs we could look at, new themes for conflict and cooperation, new socio-political axes that are underestimated? That's what this section is about. International Indians. I am moderately bullish on India, but extremely bullish on Indians. Why? Well, first let's talk about India, the country. If you're in the West, haven't been paying attention to India, and think it's still just an uninteresting third world country, you can be forgiven for that. But take a look at the following links to Orient. Here's a visual comparison of parts of Los Angeles versus India. Here's a graph showing hundreds of millions of Indians getting cheap mobile internet service over the last few years. Here's an amazing economic survey of India showing growth over the last decade. Here's a chart showing India is now number 3 in tech unicorns after the US and China. Here's a post that discusses the overall picture, the internet country. Putting that all together, there are now significant chunks of the ascending world, which are cleaner and better maintained than the descending world environments of Los Angeles and San Francisco. That doesn't mean the curves are the same, just that they overlap in a way that would have been unthinkable a few decades ago. Next, let's talk about the Indian diaspora. There are about 5 million people of Indian ancestry in the US, UK, Canada, and Australia, and a fair bit more if we include the full South Asian diaspora. They have done quite well over the last few decades. While the first generation came over with portable technical skills in medicine and engineering, the second generation within the West speaks English without an accent and with full cultural fluency, resulting in many Indians in law, filmmaking, and media. Some have even ascended to the commanding heights of politics and technology, like Kamala Harris, Sundar Pichai, and Satya Nadella. That sets up an interesting state plus network dynamic. Using our terminology, the Indian state may take one step back for every 2 steps forward, even though it's been moving forward as of late. But the network of the global Indian diaspora is just on an exponential rise. Indeed, I think the 2020s will be for the Indian network what the 2010s were for the Chinese state. Somewhat ignored at the beginning of the decade, but an important global force by the end of it. Recall that China had its first unicorn in 2010, and it took 5 years for it to get to 5 unicorns. The year after that, it had 20. Ecosystems develop very slowly and then all at once. Please don't think of this as Indian triumphalism at all. I actually find it surprising. It's just recognition of an unexpected new player entering the arena that many still underappreciate. For further context, you might read A New Idea of India, or Our Time Has Come, Transhumanism versus Anarcho-Primitivism. An important emerging political axis is transhumanism versus anarcho-primitivism. Briefly, transhumanists think technology is good, and want to use technology to change humanity in fundamental ways. Conversely, anarcho-primitivists think technology is bad, and wanted to return to the wild, deindustrialize, and abandon technology. They think of humans as pollution on this great earth. There are right and left varieties of each, though they overlap. Left transhumanists like Klaus Schwab of the World Economic Forum to some extent give rise to right anarcho-primitivists and vice versa. Basically, left transhumanists make changes to the human body that rightists find aesthetically unappealing. Conversely, right transhumanists advocate improvements to the human body that left anarcho-primitivists find terrifying. It works in reverse as well. Some anarcho-primitivists advocate a back-to-the-land kind of traditional masculinity that some transhumanists find constraining, and some anarcho-primitivists want a Unabomber-like end to industrial civilization which would, among other things, destroy the supply chains needed for the life extension sought by transhumanists. The identity stack. An issue that confused me for a while is why criticism of San Francisco seemed to anger some people irrationally. Couldn't they also see that prices and feces were both up and to the right at the same time? Eventually, what I realized is that everyone is patriotic about something, and those people were patriotic about their city, while others were patriotic about their countries, companies, or even their cryptocurrencies. To elaborate on this point, for someone who identifies themselves as a San Franciscan, criticism of the city is taken personally because that isn't a swappable piece of their life. Their company? That's just a job. It's replaceable. What they really care about is the Golden Gate Bridge, the Presidio, the 49ers, a sort of romantic identification with the city itself, and many of the people that live there. Others affiliate with their national identity first, above their city identity. They'll move between military bases at the drop of a hat, which are interchangeable, but they are willing to kill and die for the flag with which they identify. Or they might be based out of Seattle for a time, signifying that their location is immaterial, while signaling their deep love for democracy online, an identity that is non-negotiable. Still others are patriotic about their companies, those things they founded and funded, breathed life into, those entities that took all their capital and intellect to build, which are always far more fragile than they look from the outside, and which some callous outsider could break for likes with a few morale-draining tweets. And yet others characterize themselves by their cryptocurrencies, thinking of themselves first and foremost as Bitcoiners or Ethereans. These folks are often digital nomads, indifferent as to whether they see the sunset in San Francisco or Singapore, or what crypto exchange lives or dies, so long as they can check in with their community of holders each day. In each case, there's typically a large economic, social, or political stake in the thing people are identifying with. The city patriot may be a homeowner or otherwise invested in city governance. The country patriot may have signed a military contract. The company patriot may be a founder or early employee with a significant equity stake. And the cryptocurrency patriot is often a sizable holder of coins. Now, not all things are like this. People can be right-handed without identifying themselves as right-handers. They can do something without being something. So top-level identity, primary identity, that's precious, it's rare. It's the identity that supersedes all others. People might use 7 daily apps, but they have even fewer primary identities, usually only one. Primary identities need not just be about city, country, company, or cryptocurrency. They can be related to religion, ethnicity, or professions like journalist and professor. There's a huge upfront sacrifice required to become a tenured professor, or to publicly convert to a new religion, and for this reason such primary identities often make it to the fore of someone's Twitter bio. Example, Twitter bios. Here's a concrete example of the identity stack with 3 Twitter bios. Jim, hashtag here we go, hashtag Steeler Nation, all things Pennsylvania, father, husband, hashtag Christian, hashtag Army vet. Billy, immutable money, infinite frontier, eternal life, hashtag Bitcoin. Bob, Army retired, anti-terrorist assistance program, husband, father, grandfather, Iraq vet, educator, but most importantly, an American. Again, everybody is patriotic about something. Jim loves his city. Billy is patriotic about technology and transhumanism. Bob would fight for the American flag. The collection of all that defines someone in rank order is their identity stack. The top of the identity stack is the primary identity. The Pittsburgh Steelers for Jim, Bitcoin for Billy, and America for Bob. And as noted, primary identity is precious. It's the identity that supersedes all others. To build anything great, a company, a currency, a civilization, an affiliation must beat out the rest of the identity stack to become someone's primary identity. That's a high bar to meet. Techno-economic axis. The internet increases variance. The internet increases variance. Digitization allows situations to be taken to their logical conclusion instantly, even when that digital logic doesn't quite work in physical reality. This means things can flip from 0 to 1 without warning. An overnight success, 10 seconds in the making. The only certainty is rising volatility. First, the observation. Over the last 20 years, we've gone from 30-minute sitcoms to 30-second clips and 30-episode Netflix binges. From a stable 9-to-5 job to a gig economy task or a crypto windfall. From a standard life script to 30-year-olds living with their parents and 20-year-old startup CEOs. This is a very general phenomenon. You see it in the dashboard of every internet disruptor. With Uber, for example, relative to the time of a standard taxi ride, some Uber trips are much longer and others much shorter. Why is this happening? Because the internet connects people peer-to-peer. It disintermediates. In doing this, it removes the middleman, the mediator, the moderator, and the mediocrity. Of course, each of those words has a different connotation. People are happy to see the middleman and mediocrity go, but they don't necessarily want to see the moderator and mediator disappear. Nevertheless, at least at first, when the internet enters an arena, once the network Leviathan rears its head, this is what happens. Nodes that had never met before, could never have met before, now connect peer-to-peer. They can form something terrible like a Twitter mob, or they can form something amazing like ETH research. You get extreme downside and extreme upside. One analogy is to a centrifuge. If you take a sample of biological fluid from your body and centrifuge it, you'll see a bunch of layers that were previously mixed together. Then they all get separated out. That's what the internet is doing to society, to institutions. It's just centrifuging it into its constituent parts, whether that be albums separated into songs or newspapers disaggregated into articles. That's the unbundling. Then comes the rebundling. The songs get grouped into playlists, the articles grouped into Twitter feeds. This step too is profitable. It's not the same as what came before. It's a V3. It's a flexible bundle. It's the helical theory of history, where from one standpoint we've come full circle, rebundling into an album-like playlist. But from another axis, we've made amazing progress. Anyone can play any individual song and create whatever playlist they want. With that said, that rebundling is still higher variance than the pre-internet bundles that preceded them. There are millions more playlists than albums, millions more Twitter feeds than newspapers. BlueAnon, QAnon, SatoshiAnon. As the internet increases variance, we see more upside and more downside in everything. Technologists focus on the upside because the gain from the wins, like search engines, smartphones, social networks, and artificial intelligence, should compound, while the losses should be one-offs. That is, once you find a winning formula or a rebundling, you can cheaply scale it across the rest of the network relatively quickly. So this probably should lead to more net upside over time, just like every past technological revolution has. I think we're already way in the black with the internet, almost every piece of information ever in billions of people's hands for free at any time for starters. But it depends on your metric. Conversely, the establishment can only see the downside outcomes. That is, the BlueAnons can only see the QAnons who are worse than median, not the SatoshiAnons who are far better than median. It's a bit like Paul Graham's concept of the blob programmer. Just like the blob programmer can look down to see incompetence but can't look up to see brilliance, the establishmentarian can't comprehend the upwards deviations of the internet. They think it's just weird. Just like Hollywood once compared Netflix to the Albanian army, the US establishment doesn't yet understand how much better Satoshi Nakamoto or Vitalik Buterin is than every apparatchik they have in the Federal Reserve System. And they don't understand that upward deviation is creating a more competent group of global leaders than the American establishment, a more meritocratically selected group than the nepotists of the East Coast. Just as it allowed Satoshi to rise, social media is American glasnost, cryptocurrency is American perestroika. There are two particular ways that the internet increases variance worth noting: social media and digital currency. Social media increases social volatility. You can go viral or get canceled, experiencing large overnight gains or losses in status. Digital currency increases financial volatility. You can go to the moon or get wrecked, experiencing large overnight gains or losses in financial status. There's a parallel in history for this: glasnost and perestroika. Mikhail Gorbachev, the last Soviet leader, thought he could reform Soviet society by allowing more free speech via glasnost and free markets via perestroika. He didn't quite understand what he was in for. The resultant instability helped bring down the Soviet Union. Similarly, social media is like American glasnost, and cryptocurrency is American perestroika. Just as Gorbachev unleashed free speech and free market reforms because he believed communism could be reformed, the U.S. establishment actually bought their own narrative in the 1990s and 2000s about their ostensibly free and democratic society. Only now are they realizing that the many speech and thought controls that their predecessors had set up and hidden in plain sight, like stringent regulations and high capital requirements for broadcast content production, was actually the key to their continued power. Now that it's clear that the internet is to the USA what the USA was to the USSR, that it's truly free speech and free markets, they are trying to tamp down the American spring they've unleashed, but it may be too late. Obama was in a sense arguably America's Gorbachev, as he allowed technology to grow mostly unimpeded from 2008 to 2016 to billions of users without fully realizing what would ensue, the 100-year information tsunami. Few institutions that predated the internet will survive the internet. Why? Because the internet increases variance, it causes huge surges of digital pressure on older institutions that just weren't built for it. They can't handle the peak levels of social and financial stress that the internet can unleash. They're like seaside towns that weren't built for a 1,000-year flood. Michael Solana's post jump is quite good on this topic. Indeed, this is a good analogy because one of the ways to think about the internet is as a carrier of massive information waves. Most normal waves propagate in physical space. The standard partial differential equations, PDEs, are 1, 2, or 3-dimensional. For example, longitudinal waves like a slinky, transverse like electromagnetic waves, or earthquake-style spherical waves. But these information waves propagate on highly dynamic social networks where the topology of connection and disconnection changes quite a bit, naturally physical to natively digital. The digital is primary and the physical is now secondary. Three-phase transition. The digital transition happens in 3 phases. There's the physical version, the intermediate form, and then the internet native version. If you're into electrical engineering, you can think of this as analog to analog digital to natively digital. One example is the transition from a piece of paper to a scanner which scans that file into a digital version to a natively digital text file which begins life on the computer and is only printed out when it needs to be. Another example is the transition from face-to-face meetings to Zoom video, which is a scanner of faces, to natively digital VR meetings. Yet another example, physical cash to something like PayPal or FinTech, which is just a scan of the pre-existing banking system, to the truly native digital version of money, cryptocurrency. Once you see this pattern, you can see it everywhere, and you can look for those spaces where we're still stuck at the V2, at the scanned version where we've taken the offline experience and put it online, but not fundamentally innovated. Truly digital news, dashboards, on-chain event feeds. Newspapers are actually only partially digitized. In 1996, the primary version of the New York Times was the physical paper, and the Mirror was the website. Then, gradually, more and more weight got shifted to the digital version. Now it can fairly be said that the physical paper is just a printout of the website, a snapshot at a particular time. And there are online-only features like interactive graphics that are impossible to replicate in the physical paper. Most importantly, the comments section is really social media, particularly Twitter, where all the reporters are located. But this is still really just a newspaper put online. Most of it can be printed out. What's the next step in this evolution? What does natively digital news look like? There are at least 2 concepts of interest here. Morning dashboards replacing the morning newspaper, and cryptographically verifiable event feeds replacing tweets of unverifiable content. Dashboards are greater than newspapers. If you are in tech, the first thing you look at each day may be a personal or company dashboard, like your Fitbit or your sales. This is good. The first thing you look at each day shouldn't be random stories someone else picked. Should be carefully selected metrics you want to improve. This is a good vector of attack to definitionally disrupt newspapers. If we think about it from Clayton Christensen's jobs to be done perspective, newspapers have this incredible pride of place. First thing you look at in the morning. but typically do not add enough value to deserve that position. On-chain event feeds are greater than Twitter, which is greater than newspapers. One key observation is that just as many sports articles are digests of box scores, and many financial articles are summaries of the day's stock action, so too are many political and tech articles merely wrappers around tweets. Because news breaks on Twitter, so eventually the next kind of newspaper will look something like a cryptographically verified version of Twitter. The first draft of history will be the raw on-chain event feed, written directly to the ledger of record by billions of writers and censors around the world. In other words, truly digital newspapers will be on-chain event feeds, digitally signed crypto oracles, not corporations, remote work to remote life. My friend Daniel Gross remarked that 2020 will be seen by future historians as the year when the internet age truly began. The lasting impact of COVID-19 is that it flipped the world from physical to digital first. Because the internet in 2000 or 2010 couldn't bear the load of the entire physical world. But by 2020 it kind of could. Now it's not just about remote work, but remote life. During the pandemic, every sector that had previously been socially resistant to the internet, healthcare, education, law, finance, government itself, capitulated. Those aspects of society that had been very gradually changing with technology shifted overnight. For example, the convention of politeness shifted. Now it was rude to ask for an in-person business meeting as you do it remote if at all possible. With vaccination, many of these things have flipped back, but they won't come back all the way. Digitization was permanently accelerated. It used to be that the physical world was primary and the internet was the mirror. Now that has flipped. The digital world is primary and the physical world is just the mirror. We're still physical beings, of course, but important events happen on the internet first and then materialize in the physical world later, if ever. From printing to materializing. All value eventually becomes digital because we are generalizing the concept of printing, from inking a piece of paper to actually materializing digital things in the physical world. This is counterintuitive and you'll have objections. But let's get there in a few steps. 1. Much value creation is already digital. If you're reading this, you're probably an information worker. You may not have thought about it this way, but the majority of your waking hours are probably spent in front of one screen or another. A laptop for work, a phone on the go, a tablet for reading, and so on. So most of your life is already spent in the matrix in a sense, even before the advent of widespread AR and VR. Short of a pullback to an Amish or Andaman Islander existence, most of your life is and will be digitally influenced in some form. Moreover, much of the value in the physical world comes from blueprints created on a computer in some form. EEG, the iPhones manufactured in Shenzhen, gain much of their value from the designers in California. So a good fraction of value creation is largely digital. 2, more value creation is becoming digital. Read Packy McCormick's article on the great online game and think about every information worker essentially pressing buttons to earn cryptocurrency in a giant globalized internet economy. That's what 2030 or 2035 is on track to look like. 3, much spending is already digital. Think about what fraction of your spending already goes to digital goods like books, music, software as a service, and the like. Now think about what fraction of the remainder goes through a digital interface of some kind, whether through an e-commerce website like Amazon or a point-of-sale terminal via Apple Pay. So it's already fairly uncommon for people in industrialized societies to do a fully offline, purely physical transaction, which might be conceptualized as hand a $5 bill over at a farmer's market for several tomatoes. 4, many actions can be analogized to printing. Now take this one step further and think about the remaining offline components as printing something out, though you can use the word materializing if it suits. You hit a button on Amazon and a complicated multi-jurisdictional delivery process ensues, resulting in a box landing at your front door. You hit a button on Uber and a car arrives. You hit a button on DoorDash and food arrives. You hit a button to rent an Airbnb and then another to open the smart lock and the door to housing opens. You can do the same for the door to your co-working space office or the door to your electric car. So more and more of the goods people prize in the physical world are in a sense printed out. 5, many printing actions can be fully automated. Today, there's a human in the loop for things like food delivery. But as robotics improves, this could in theory become a completely electromechanical process. just like printing. Every individual step from the farm to table could be automated. As this visual shows, there are already robots for each step. Robots in the fertilizer factories for harvesting and for last-mile delivery. As an exercise, it'd be useful to a full-stack example where someone prints out an apple and it's fully robotically grown and delivered, even if in practice you'd have stockpiles of apples rather than slowly growing them on demand. So if you put all that together, all value is digital. Everything starts on the computer, generates cryptocurrency, and can be used either to buy digital goods or to pay robots to materialize things in the physical world. Humans will still exist, of course, but the economy will become the crypto economy. All value goes digital. The productivity mystery. What is the productivity mystery? Well, we really should be in the middle of a golden age of productivity. Within living memory, computers did not exist. Photocopiers did not exist. Even backspace did not exist. You had to type it all by hand. It wasn't that long ago that you couldn't search all your documents, sort them, back them up, look things up, copy-paste things, email things, change fonts of things, or undo things. Instead, you had to type it all on a typewriter. If you're doing information work, relative to your ancestors who worked with papyrus, paper, or typewriter, you are a golden god surfing on a sea of electrons. You can make things happen in seconds that would have taken them weeks, if they could do them at all. We should also be far more productive in the physical world. After all, our predecessors built railroads, skyscrapers, airplanes, and automobiles without computers or the internet, and built them fast, using just typewriters, slide rules, and safety margins. This is a corollary to the Thiel, Cowan, and Hall concept of the Great Stagnation. Where has all that extra productivity gone? It doesn't appear manifest in the physical world for sure, though you can argue it is there in the internet world. There are a few possible theses. 1. The Great Distraction. All the productivity we gained has been frittered away on equal and opposite distractions like social media and games. 2. The Great Dissipation. The productivity has been dissipated on things like forms, compliance, and process. 3. The Great Divergence. The productivity is here, it's just only harnessed by the indistractable few. The founders of tech unicorns, for example, may have more ability to focus online than most. 4. The Great Dilemma. The productivity has been burned in bizarre ways that require line-by-line profiling of everything, like this tunnel study. 5. The Great Dumbness. The productivity is here, but we've just made dumb decisions in the West while others have harnessed it. See, for example, China building a train station in 9 hours versus taking 100 to 1,000 times that long to upgrade a Caltrain stop. Now, yes, I'm sure not every train station in China is built in 9 hours, and wouldn't be surprised if some regions in the US, or the West more broadly, do better than SFBA, but feels likely that a systematic study would find a qualitative speed gap 10 to 100 times or more. 6. The Great Delay. The productivity will be here, but is delayed till the arrival of robotics. That is, for things we can do completely on the computer, productivity has measurably accelerated. It is 100 times faster to email something than to mail it, but a slow human still needs to act on it. So, in this hypothesis, humans are now the limiting factor. Essentially, representing a complex project on disk in something like Google Docs may not be the productivity win we think it is. Humans still need to comprehend all those electronic documents to build the thing in real life. So the problem may be in the analog-digital interface. Do we need to actuate as fast as we compute? That would mean zero-delay robotic task completion will be the true productivity unlock, and that we haven't gone full digital yet. So long as humans are still in the loop, we won't get the full benefits of digital productivity. I don't know the answer, but I think the line-by-line profiling approach used on the tunnels is a good but slow way to find out exactly what went wrong, while the approach of looking at other countries and time periods, namely studying history, could actually be the fast way of figuring out what might be right. Linguistic borders of the internet. If the organic borders of the physical world are rivers and mountain ranges, the organic borders of the internet are software incompatibilities and language barriers. The first of these is obvious. Facebook's ecosystem is distinct from Google's is distinct from Ethereum's, because the backends don't fully overlap, because they're incompatible at the software level. The second is a bit less obvious. You can imagine the internet being cut up into continental scale pieces, with the English language internet being the largest with billions of people, the Chinese language internet being the second largest with 1.3 billion, and so on for the Spanish language, Japanese language, Korean language, Russian language internets. One huge difference between the English internet and Chinese internet is that the former is global and arguably decentralized, while the latter is heavily concentrated in China, with the CCP maintaining root control over most key nodes. Another important consequence is that the English internet is about to admit 1 billion new users in the form of all the Indians who are newly coming online. And because the Indian internet becomes a much bigger part of the English language discourse, it will be difficult for the US establishment to censor the English language internet as much as they want to, because hosting can be based in the sovereign country of India. Network defects. A network defect is when increasing the size beyond a certain point decreases the value of the network. Metcalfe's law doesn't include this dynamic, as utility is projected to just increase to infinity as network size grows. But there are a few different mathematical models that predict this outcome, such as congestion-based models or this post by Vitalik. Repulsion within a network is a key dynamic that can lead to network defect. The idea is that two or more subgroups within a network have such conflict that it reduces the global value of the network for both, until one of them defects to another network. So it's a network defect in both senses of the term, a failure and a political defection. Foreseeable futures. AR glasses bridge physical and digital worlds. Augmented reality, AR glasses may be the most foreseeable invention of all time. In the 90s and 2000s, people talked about the convergence device. Gates imagined it would be a smart television, but it turned out to be the iPhone. What's the next convergence device? I think it's AR glasses. Take the following technologies: Snapchat's Spectacles, Facebook's Oculus Quest, Google Glass Enterprise, Apple's AR Kit, augmented reality apps like Pokemon Go. If you put all those together, you get a vision of augmented reality glasses that give you instant-on access to the digital world in your field of view, and perhaps darken with another touch to give you virtual reality. Anyone can teleport into or out of your field of vision with your consent. You can right-click on any object to get AI-informed metadata on it, and you can get computer-guided instructions to execute almost any physical procedure from repairing a machine to sewing. We know that millions of people manage to wear glasses all day, and they're lighter than headsets and easy to take on and off. So these may become as ubiquitous as phones. It will be an engineering marvel to get there, of course, and while Apple is a strong contender, Facebook may be the most likely company to be able to ship them given its progress with Oculus and founder-led innovation. Why will AR glasses be so big? If you think about how much of your life is spent looking at a screen, whether it's a laptop or a phone or a watch, greater than 50% of your waking hours is already spent in the matrix. AR glasses would reduce screen time in one sense, freeing you up to compute on the go without looking at a screen per se, but increase digital time in another sense, as people would constantly have these HUDs active to see the world. This means even more of our daily experience will blend not just the physical world dominated by natural law, but the digital world run by human-written code. The offline world still exists. Physics and biology still exist, but algorithms and databases run even more of human existence. The network surrounds us to an even greater extent than the state did. If combined with some kind of gesture interface, gloves, rings, or perhaps just sophisticated motion tracking, you might be able to use your hands to do anything in the digital realm. So with AR glasses, the digital and physical realms fully blend, and people would actually be able to see and interact with an open metaverse in real life. Experimental macroeconomics. Cryptoeconomics is transforming macroeconomics into an experimental subject. Why? Because you can actually issue a currency, set a monetary policy, get opt-in participants, and test your theories in practice. The proof is in the pudding, and if successful, the pudding is worth many billions of dollars. This refutes the premise that economics and business are wholly disjoint. They aren't disjoint at all. Microeconomics is the theory of individuals and firms, which is directly related to running a business. Each price you set, each company you start, is a kind of microeconomic experiment, albeit usually a poorly controlled one. Macroeconomics Macroeconomics, by contrast, until recently was off limits to experiment. A first step forward was MIT's Edward Castronova early work on virtual economies like World of Warcraft. Now anyone can create a cryptocurrency, set monetary policy, and see what happens. Perhaps the closest thing to experimental macroeconomics prior to cryptocurrency was the experience of setting up and scaling massive two-sided marketplaces like Airbnb, eBay, Google Ads, etc. You quickly learn that ideology is a poor guide. Naive libertarianism and progressivism both fail. Why? Basically, people want to make money on those platforms. They absolutely do respond to incentives, unlike the naive progressive model that it'll all be altruistic behavior. But the marketplace operator has immense power to shape incentives for good or ill. So the naive libertarian belief in a fully decentralized Hayekian order does not always come about. American anarchy, Chinese control, international intermediate. Here we give a bit more detail on a sci-fi scenario in which the US descends into a chaotic Second American Civil War. The CCP responds with the opposite extreme of a total surveillance state that traps wealth in its digital UN network, and the rest of the world, if we're lucky, builds a stable alternative of opt-in startup societies that peacefully rejects these extremes. To be clear, you don't need to believe in this scenario to build startup societies and network states. But it's a mental model for the future, which we present for the same reason that Ray Dalio put out a somewhat euphemistic model of how the US order could fall to an external competitor, and Peter Turchin put out a less euphemistic model of how the US could fall into internal disorder. American anarchy, prosperity, tyranny, or anarchy. The progressive vision is that the West is getting more free, equal, and prosperous. The dystopian vision is that we're actually in the incipient stages of tyranny, whether that be fascist or woke respectively. What's under-theorized is a third possibility, namely that in the US at least the inconclusive power struggle between Democrats and Republicans means America is headed for anarchy. As the events of 2021 unfolded, it became clear that even with unified control of the federal government, the Democrats were no more effective than the Republicans had been with comparable power 4 years earlier. Neither faction proved capable of implementing the total top-down domination that some in their party advocated and many in the other party feared. Meanwhile, the non-partisan state capacity of the US as a whole continued to visibly decay. Squint past the pandemic's half-ignored TSA-like COVID regulations, and you saw a half-ignored TSA-like COVID regulator, namely a failing state that people did half-ignore, and arguably had to half-ignore because the USA itself was now the TSA, and the TSA, they knew, was safety theater. Today, in the territory governed by this inept bureaucracy, we now see power outages, supply chain shortages, rampant flooding, and uncontrolled fires. We see riots, arsons, shootings, stabbings, robberies, and murders. We see digital mobs that become physical mobs. We see a complete loss of trust in institutions from the state to the media. We see anti-capitalism and anti-rationalism. We see states breaking away from the US federal government at home and abroad. And we see the end of power, the revolt of the public, the defeat of the military, the inflation of the dollar, and looming ahead, an American anarchy. What's coming isn't fascism or communism like the left-wing and right-wing pundits would have us believe, even though they don't believe it themselves. What's coming is the exact opposite of that. A world where the civilized concepts of freedom and equity are extrapolated to their decivilizational limit, where you ain't the boss of me and we are all equal, where all hierarchy is illegitimate and with it all authority, where no one is in charge and everything is in chaos. We can argue this may be preferable to the status quo in the same way some think the chaotic Russia of the 1990s was on balance better than the authoritarian Soviet Union of the 1980s. We can argue it may be inevitable. As the Chinese proverb goes, the empire long divided must unite, long united must divide. And we can argue that this transitional period of anarchy may be lamentable, but that it's better than the other team being in charge, and that we can build a better order on the other side. Maybe so, and that's what this book is about. But prior to any rebundling, I think we're on track for quite the unbundling. Maximalist versus woke. With that poetic introduction over, let's get down to specifics. Rather than seeing an indefinite continuation of the post-war order, or the long second Cold War between the US and China that many are preparing for, The U.S. may be on track to descend into an American anarchy, a chaotic Second American Civil War between the U.S. establishment and its people. We foresee two main factions. The first will align around the U.S. federal government, NYT and establishment media, wokeness, the dollar, and the Democrat Party. They'll say they're fighting for democracy against insurrectionists. The second will align around state governments, decentralized media, maximalism, Bitcoin, and the Republican Party. They'll say they're fighting for freedom against fiat tyranny. We can't predict their names, but rather than Democrat blue and Republican red, let's call them wokes and maximalists, or more neutrally, dollar green and Bitcoin orange. Crucially, in this scenario, many non-whites will switch sides from Democrat blue to Bitcoin orange, because whether black, white, Latino, or Asian, everyone's savings will be crushed by inflation. Many tech founders and independent writers will also go orange. Tools like Square Cash will facilitate mass exodus to Bitcoin, and newsletter writers will put out narratives that contest establishment media. Conversely, many institutional loyalists will flip from Republican red to dollar green, including the police, military, and neoconservatives, simply because they are in the final analysis the kind of team players and natural conservatives who would have fought for both Tsarist Russia and the Soviet Union. My country, right or wrong, the role of centralized tech companies will be key. By default, they'll swing to the dollar green side, but many tech founders will lean Bitcoin orange, so we could see centralized tech companies supporting both sides, with older and fully walkified firms like Google firmly on the green side, and newer founder-controlled firms located in places like Miami and Texas trending orange. How America builds towards conflict. How could something as radical as a second American Civil War happen? You could write a book on this, and several people have, but in lieu of that, we'll give a bullet-pointed list. Before reviewing it, you might want to reread Ray Dalio, Peter Turchin, and Strauss and Howe if you want more context, as we won't be able to recapitulate every citation that informs this projection. Done? Okay, here we go. 1. Political polarization is way up. All the graphs show this now. The U.S. is not really a nation-state anymore, but a binational country comprised of two warring ethnic groups that disagree on fundamental moral premises. It is about God, gays, and guns. But it's also about censorship, surveillance, and inflation. 2. State capacity is way down. The competent America of mid-century, the left-right fusion that FDR put together, the America that combined a powerful centralized state with social conservatism, the America depicted in countless movies, the America that won World War II and the Cold War, that country is over. This U.S. government can't build a bathroom in San Francisco, let alone a cost-effective fighter jet, destroyer, combat ship, or aircraft carrier. 3. Economic prosperity is declining. All the political infighting of the last decade happened during a period of relative prosperity, even if it was based on the artificial expedient of printing money. But now that we face potentially years of inflation and stagnation, unhappiness will increase. Already you're seeing articles coming trying to acclimatize people to lower standards of living, to eat bugs and live in a pod. And Turchin's Clio-dynamical graphs put numbers to these feelings. 4. Envy is increasing. This is normally phrased in terms of inequality, and that is indeed one way to look at it. But let's rotate it by a few degrees and talk about envy. The return of great fortunes, the rise of social media, and the decline in religion has led to escalating envy. Every day, people can see others online who appear to be better off than they are, and who appear to be rising while they are falling. Whether that rise is real or not, whether it is due to the other person's own efforts or not, it doesn't really matter to the person who feels they aren't getting ahead, who feels they are falling behind. Without a rising tide that lifts all boats, the rational act for some is to sink the other boats, to pull escaping crabs down into the bucket. Why? Because misery loves company, and because stopping someone from getting too far ahead means they can't outcompete you for houses or mates. The only way out of this negative sum trap is to build provably positive sum systems and high-trust societies. But that's exactly what the U.S. establishment is not doing. It's fomenting hatred on social media every day and giving new reasons not to trust it, whether that be the insistent assurance that inflation is transitory or all the other episodes of official misinformation. 5. Foreign military defeat looms. Leaving aside your feelings about the pandemic, The military propaganda beforehand is worth reviewing. In 2018, the U.S. Department of Defense put out press releases on its preparation for a pandemic, on its sophisticated vaccines, and then nothing happened. This was the first time many in the public had the opportunity to directly compare statements about secret military programs to the actual results, just as you might compare projections by corporate executives to the actual results. And the size of that gap was remarkable. It indicated that at least some of the U.S. military was just words, and not real. I remarked on this in early 2021, months before the defeat in Afghanistan gave yet another example of the gap between U.S. military rhetoric and reality, where Kabul wasn't going to fall in a few days, and then it did. As of this writing, we're 4 months into the Russo-Ukrainian War of 2022. After an initial surge of attention, global interest in the conflict has dropped off a cliff. The New York Times and other establishment media outlets have now instructed the U.S. administration to pursue peace, and various reports indicate that the Ukrainians are quickly plowing through ammunition stockpiles while the Russians are gaining ground with long-range artillery. To be clear, it's not at all obvious what will happen. There's fog of war with everything, but in the event of an outright Russian victory, defined as gaining territory they didn't have prior to the war, that wouldn't augur well for the U.S. establishment. 6. U.S. states are pulling away from the feds. There's enormous coverage of U.S. politics at the national level because it attracts clicks from all over. But local politics doesn't get the same attention.